The clock reads 3:47 a.m. when I jolt awake, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. The sheets beneath me are soaked through with sweat, clinging to my 73-year-old body like a second skin. For a moment, I'm not in my small apartment in Phoenix. I'm 8 years old again, standing in that suffocating pink bedroom, waiting for her footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor. Eleanor, come here, sweetheart. The voice echoes in my head, syrupy sweet on the surface, but with that underlying current of steel that meant I was in trouble. Again. Always in trouble for something. Breathing too loudly. Sitting wrong. Existing in a way that didn't meet her impossible standards. I force myself to sit up, my arthritic joints protesting as I swing my legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor is cold against my bare feet, grounding me in the present. I am Eleanor Martinez now, not Eleanor Catherine Thompson. I am safe. I am 73 years old. She has been dead for 16 years. But the nightmare doesn't care about logic or time. It visits me nearly every night, playing the same scene over and over, her voice calling my name, followed by those deliberate footsteps approaching my bedroom door. In the dream, I always know what's coming, but I can never move, never run, never scream. I'm frozen in that moment of anticipation, waiting for the door to creak open and reveal her silhouette backlit by the hallway light. My hands shake as I reach for the glass of water on my nightstand, knocking over the small pile of photographs I'd been looking through earlier. They scatter across the floor like fallen leaves, glimpses of a life I've spent decades trying to rebuild. There's one of my daughter Sarah's wedding, one of my grandson's high school graduation, another of me at my retirement party from the library where I worked for 27 years. Normal moments. Happy moments. The kind of life I never thought I'd have. But tonight, like so many nights before, the past feels more real than the present. I lower myself carefully into the worn armchair by the window, pulling my robe tighter around my shoulders. The city never sleeps, and neither do I, it seems. Street lights cast long shadows across my living room, and I can hear the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Sometimes I wonder if I moved to Phoenix just because it was as far from that small Pennsylvania town as I could get without leaving the country entirely. The photographs on the nightstand seem to mock me in the dim light. There's one I keep hidden beneath the others, the only picture I have of her. Margaret Thompson, my mother. The woman everyone said I was so lucky to have. You're blessed, Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson from next door used to say. Not every child has such a devoted mother. She loves you so much, the pastor would tell me after church, watching as mother straightened my dress collar with what looked like tender care but felt like a vice around my throat. What I wouldn't give to have a mother like yours, my friend Susan once whispered during a sleepover, the last one mother ever allowed. She's so perfect. Perfect. That was the word everyone used to describe her. Perfect Margaret Thompson with her perfect house and her perfect manners and her perfect little daughter who never spoke out of turn, never fidgeted, never showed any sign of the terror that lived in her chest like a constant, gnawing hunger. I pick up that hidden photograph now, my fingers trembling as I study her face. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Porcelain skin, dark hair always perfectly styled, lips that knew exactly when to smile for the camera. In this picture, she's standing behind me at my 8th birthday party, her hands resting on my shoulders. To anyone else, it would look like a loving embrace. I can still feel the pressure of her fingers digging into my collarbones, the warning squeeze that meant I better not embarrass her in front of the neighbors. The woman in this photograph baked cookies for school fundraisers. She volunteered at the church. She never missed a parent-teacher conference. She was everything a mother should be, at least according to the 1950s Handbook of Perfect American Families. She was also a monster. The realization hits me again, as fresh and shocking as it was 50 years ago when I first allowed myself to think those words. My mother was a monster. Not the kind that hides under beds or lurks in closets, but the kind that serves you breakfast with a smile and then spends the rest of the day systematically destroying your soul, piece by careful piece. I set the photograph down and lean back in my chair, closing my eyes. The nightmare is fading now, replaced by something worse, memory. Because unlike dreams, memories are real. They happened. They shaped me. They're the reason I still wake up screaming at 73 years old, the reason I've never learned to trust a gentle touch, the reason I spent most of my adult life apologizing for taking up space in the world. Tomorrow, I tell myself. Tomorrow I'll finally do what I should have done decades ago. Tomorrow, I'll tell the truth about the woman they said I was so lucky to have. The morning light filters through my apartment window as I sit at my small kitchen table, that photograph of Mother still in my hands. In the daylight, she looks even more like the saint everyone believed her to be. But I know better now. I've known better for a long time. Let me tell you about Margaret Thompson, the woman who fooled an entire town for over 2 decades. It was 1957 when this picture was taken, and Mother was at the height of her performance. Millbrook, Pennsylvania was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where reputation meant everything, and where my mother had carefully cultivated an image of absolute perfection. She was 32 then, married to my father for 10 years, and she had turned motherhood into an art form, at least in public. Every Sunday morning, she would dress me in my finest dress, the navy blue one with the white collar that she'd spent hours pressing until it was crisp as paper. She'd brush my hair exactly 100 strokes, counting each one aloud, then secure it with ribbons that matched my outfit perfectly. We would walk to St. Mary's Catholic Church, her gloved hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and I swear every person we passed would stop to comment on what a lovely picture we made. "Margaret, you're raising such a well-behaved little girl," Mrs. Kowalski from the grocery store would say, beaming at us both. "Eleanor never seems to have a hair out of place." Mother would smile, that radiant smile that lit up her entire face, and pull me closer. "Oh, Eleanor's such a joy. We're best friends, aren't we, sweetheart?" I would nod, because that's what I was supposed to do. I would smile, because that's what good daughters did. And I would ignore the way her fingers dug into my shoulder, the silent reminder that I was being watched, evaluated, judged with every breath I took. The church ladies adored her. She organized the annual Christmas pageant, spending weeks creating elaborate costumes and coordinating rehearsals. She baked dozens of cookies for every bake sale, each one decorated with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made other mothers sigh with envy. During the summer, she hosted garden parties in our backyard, complete with finger sandwiches cut into perfect triangles and lemonade served in crystal glasses that sparkled in the afternoon sun. I remember one particular afternoon when the Methodist minister's wife, Mrs. Patterson, was visiting. She watched as Mother served tea from our best china set, commenting on how spotless our house was, how well-behaved I was as I sat quietly in the corner with my book. "Margaret, you make it look so effortless," Mrs. Patterson said, stirring sugar into her tea. "How do you manage to keep everything so perfect?" Mother laughed, that musical laugh that made everyone else smile. "Oh, it's not perfect, Helen. But Eleanor and I have our little routines, don't we, dear? We like things just so." What Mrs. Patterson didn't see was the way Mother's eyes found mine across the room, the slight tightening around her mouth that meant I was sitting wrong, or breathing too loudly, or somehow failing to meet her standards. She didn't see the way my stomach clenched with fear, wondering what correction awaited me once our guest left. At school, I was the envy of my classmates. While other children complained about their mother's rules or restrictions, I said nothing. What was there to say? That my mother loved me so much she spent hours teaching me the proper way to hold a fork. That she cared about my posture so deeply she would have me practice walking with books balanced on my head. That she was so concerned with my education that she would quiz me on my lessons every night until I could recite them perfectly. My teacher, Mrs. Sullivan, often kept me after school to help with small tasks. She would comment on how polite I was, how mature for my age, how fortunate I was to have such an attentive mother. If she noticed that I rarely spoke unless spoken to, or that I seemed to hold my breath whenever an adult approached, she never mentioned it. "Your mother must be so proud of you," she would say as I carefully erased the chalkboard, making sure to clean every corner thoroughly. "You're such a little lady." The truth was, I didn't know how to be anything else. By age 8, I had been molded into Mother's vision of perfection, a miniature adult who never ran, never shouted, never displayed any emotion that might reflect poorly on her parenting. I was her masterpiece, her proof that she was the most devoted mother in Millbrook. The town's newspaper even featured us once, in an article about modern motherhood. There was a photograph of Mother and me in our kitchen, she in her apron with flour on her hands, me standing beside her with a mixing bowl, both of us smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Margaret Thompson and daughter Eleanor demonstrate that the art of homemaking is best learned young." What the photographer didn't capture was the 3 hours we spent getting that candid shot just right, the way Mother gripped my wrist when I didn't smile brightly enough, the silent tears I cried later when she critiqued my performance in excruciating detail. But to everyone else, we were perfect. Mother was perfect. And I was the luckiest little girl in the world to have such a devoted, caring, loving mother. If only they had known what happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the front door closed behind our guests. The rules started when I was 6, so gradually that I didn't recognize them as chains until it was too late to break free. "Eleanor, darling, a proper young lady never chews with her mouth open." Mother's voice was honey-sweet as she corrected me at breakfast, her hand gently closing my jaw. "Let's try again, shall we?" At first, I thought all mothers taught their daughters these things. But Mother's lessons were different. They were precise, unforgiving, and multiplied like weeds in a garden. Within a month, breakfast had become a minefield. I had to chew each bite exactly 23 times, Mother counted silently, her eyes never leaving my face. I had to place my fork down between bites, dab my lips with my napkin after every third swallow, and never, ever reach for the salt without asking permission first. My orange juice had to be consumed in small sips, never gulped, and I had to hold the glass with both hands to prevent any possibility of spilling. "These aren't punishments, sweetheart," Mother would say as she watched me struggle through another meal. "This is how mothers show their daughters they care. Other mothers let their children eat like animals, but I love you too much for that." The dining room rules were just the beginning. By the time I turned 8, Mother had created an entire universe of regulations that governed every moment of my existence. There were rules about how to sit in church, ankles crossed, never legs, hands folded in lap, eyes forward, no fidgeting during the entire service. Rules about how to walk upstairs, one hand on the banister, measured steps, no rushing, no dragging my feet. Rules about how to hold a book, spine straight, pages turned only by the corner, never the middle. The bathroom rituals were particularly elaborate. I had to brush my teeth in a specific pattern for exactly 2 minutes while Mother stood in the doorway with her watch. Upper left molars, upper right molars, lower left, lower right, then the front teeth in small circular motions. I had to wash my hands with soap for 30 seconds, counting silently. The towel had to be hung with the edges perfectly aligned, and the sink had to be wiped down completely before I could leave. "Cleanliness is next to godliness, Eleanor," Mother would remind me as I performed these rituals. "A lady's personal hygiene reflects her character." Speaking became a careful dance of precision. No contractions, "I cannot," instead of "I can't." No mumbling, no rushing through words. I had to pause between sentences, make eye contact when spoken to, and never, ever interrupt an adult. My voice had to be modulated to the perfect volume, not too loud, not too soft, but just right for whatever room I was in. The punishment for breaking a rule was swift and escalating. At first, it was just repetition. "Let's try that again, Eleanor, but this time like a proper young lady." Then came the shame exercises, standing in the corner with my nose pressed against the wall, reciting the rule I had broken until Mother decided I had learned my lesson. But as the rules multiplied, so did the consequences. A slumped shoulder earned me an hour of standing with my arms outstretched, balancing books on my palms. Speaking too quickly meant writing lines in my most perfect penmanship. I will speak clearly and thoughtfully like a proper young lady, 500 times. Spilling even a drop of water meant scrubbing the entire kitchen floor on my hands and knees until it gleamed. The worst punishment was the silence. When I committed what Mother deemed a serious infraction, like forgetting to say, please, when asking for more milk, she would stop speaking to me entirely. She would look through me as if I were invisible, preparing my meals and setting them in front of me without a word. The silence could last for hours, sometimes entire days, and it was more terrifying than any physical punishment could have been. During these silent periods, I would try desperately to figure out what I had done wrong, reviewing every moment, every word, every gesture. I would apologize to the empty air, begging for forgiveness for sins I couldn't even name. And when Mother finally spoke to me again, would be so grateful, so relieved, that I would promise to be better, to try harder, to never disappoint her again. You see, Eleanor, she would say, stroking my hair with what felt like affection but carried the weight of ownership, this is what real love looks like. I'm molding you into something special. The isolation was gradual but deliberate. Invitations to birthday parties were declined because we have more important things to do. Playdates were discouraged because other children might teach you bad habits. Even my relationship with my father was carefully managed. Mother would intercept our conversations, finish my sentences, and always position herself between us during family activities. Your father works so hard for us, she would explain. The last thing he needs is to worry about your behavior. It's my job to make sure you're perfect for him. By age 10, I had no friends, no allies, no escape from Mother's ever-watchful gaze. The rules had become so numerous and complex that I lived in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing which invisible line I might cross next. I walked through our house like a ghost, silent and careful, existing solely to reflect Mother's superior parenting skills. I had become exactly what she wanted, a perfectly controlled little doll who never spoke out of turn, never moved without permission, never showed any emotion that might embarrass her. But perfection, I was learning, was a prison with golden bars, and I was its only prisoner. By my 12th birthday, I had learned to live in a state of perpetual terror disguised as obedience. Every morning, I would wake with my stomach already twisted in knots, wondering what new way I might fail Mother's impossible standards. The rules had multiplied beyond counting, and with them, Mother's anger had grown sharper, more unpredictable, more dangerous. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed. I remember because we were studying the Revolutionary War in school, and I had dared to express enthusiasm about the Boston Tea Party during dinner. Mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Enthusiasm is unbecoming in a young lady, Eleanor, she said, her voice carrying that edge I had learned to fear. And your posture is atrocious. Stand up. I stood immediately, my chair scraping against the floor. Father glanced up from his newspaper but said nothing. He never said anything anymore. Walk to the wall and back. Properly this time. I walked across the dining room, my spine rigid, my steps measured. When I returned to my chair, Mother shook her head with disgust. Again. You're slouching like a common street child. I walked again. And again. And again. Each time, Mother found something wrong. My shoulders weren't square enough, my chin wasn't high enough, my hands weren't positioned correctly at my sides. After the 7th attempt, my legs were shaking from exhaustion, and I made the mistake of stumbling slightly. Are you mocking me, Eleanor? The question came out like a whip crack. I had heard this tone before, but never quite this sharp, never quite this cold. No, Mother. I'm tired. Tired? She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with deliberate menace. Tired? Proper young ladies don't get tired from simple exercises. Are you calling me unreasonable? No, Mother, I would never. Go to your room. Now. I fled upstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat on my bed, still wearing my school dress, and waited. The waiting was always the worst part. Sometimes Mother would come up immediately. Sometimes she would let me sit for hours, my anxiety building until I could barely breathe. This time, she came up after exactly 30 minutes. I know because I watched every second tick by on my bedside clock. Stand up when I enter the room, she said, though I was already scrambling to my feet. She closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Her face was calm, almost serene, which terrified me more than any expression of anger could have. Do you know why I'm disappointed in you, Eleanor? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Because despite all my love, all my patience, all my careful teaching, you still behave like a wild animal. You slouch. You speak without thinking. You show enthusiasm like some common child with no breeding whatsoever. Her hand moved to her belt, and I felt my bladder nearly give way. But instead of removing it, she simply adjusted it, letting the gesture sink in. I love you too much to let you become ordinary, Eleanor. Do you understand that? Yes, Mother. But love sometimes requires difficult lessons. What happened next, I can barely bring myself to remember even now, 60 years later. Mother's hands found my throat, not in anger, but with a calm, deliberate pressure that made breathing suddenly impossible. Her thumbs pressed against my windpipe while her fingers wrapped around the back of my neck. This is what happens when you disappoint me, she whispered, her face inches from mine. This is what happens when you forget that everything I do is for your own good. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I clawed at her hands, but she was stronger, and my struggles only seemed to fuel her sense of righteousness. Stop fighting me, Eleanor. Stop making this harder than it needs to be. Just when I thought I might lose consciousness, she released me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing, my throat on fire. Mother knelt beside me, her hand stroking my hair with the same gentle touch she might use to pet a favorite cat. There, sweetheart. It's over now. You see how much I love you. I care enough to correct you when no one else will. She helped me to my feet, smoothing my dress and adjusting my hair as if nothing had happened. Now, let's try that walk again, shall we? Remember, shoulders back, chin up. Show me you've learned your lesson. I walked for her. I walked until my legs shook, until my vision blurred, until I could barely stand. And through it all, Mother watched with the satisfied smile of someone who had successfully trained a difficult pet. That night, I lay in bed with my throat aching and my spirit broken. I had tried to tell my teacher about the rules, about the punishments, about the way Mother looked at me sometimes. But Mrs. Henderson had simply smiled and said, "Oh, Eleanor, you're so fortunate to have such a dedicated mother. She only wants what's best for you." I realized then that no one would ever believe me. Mother's reputation was too perfect, her public face too convincing. I was trapped in a house with a woman who could hurt me whenever she pleased, and the entire world would congratulate her for it. That was the night I stopped being a child and became a survivor instead. When I was 13, Tommy was born, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to love someone more than I feared Mother's wrath. He was perfect in all the ways that mattered, healthy, beautiful, with Father's dark eyes and a smile that could light up the entire room. But more importantly, he was innocent. He didn't know about the rules yet, didn't understand that our house was a minefield where one wrong step could trigger an explosion. For the first few months, Mother seemed different around Tommy. Softer. She would coo at him during his feedings, stroke his cheek with a tenderness I had never seen her show me. I watched from the doorway, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. Was this what normal mothers looked like? Was this how she had once held me, before I had started disappointing her? "Come help me with your baby brother, Eleanor," Mother would say, and I would approach cautiously, still expecting a correction, a criticism, a punishment for breathing wrong in his presence. But Tommy was magic. When he was in the room, Mother's voice stayed gentle. Her hands remained soft. It was as if his presence cast a protective spell that I desperately wanted to hide inside. I became his shadow, his self-appointed guardian angel. I would volunteer to help with his feedings, his diaper changes, his baths. Not because Mother asked, but because being near Tommy meant being near the only version of Mother that felt safe. "You're such a good big sister," she would say, watching me carefully burp him after his bottle. "Tommy is so lucky to have you." Lucky. That word again. But for the first time, I felt like maybe I was the lucky one. Tommy was 6 months old when I realized that Mother's gentleness around him wasn't temporary, it was strategic. She was careful never to frighten him, never to show him the face that I knew so well. When I was holding him and she needed to correct me, she would wait until he was sleeping or looking away. Her voice would drop to a whisper, but the venom was still there. "Put him down and come here, Eleanor. You're holding him wrong." I would lay Tommy gently in his crib, my hands shaking as I prepared for whatever lesson was coming. Mother would position herself so that Tommy couldn't see her face, couldn't hear her words, couldn't witness what was about to happen to his big sister. "A proper young lady doesn't slouch even when holding a baby," she would hiss, her fingers digging into my shoulders with familiar cruelty. "You'll teach him bad habits." Tommy would babble happily in his crib, unaware that his sister was being systematically destroyed just feet away from him. As he grew older and more aware, I had to learn new skills. I became an expert at reading Mother's moods, at recognizing the subtle signs that meant danger was approaching. When I saw her jaw tighten or her fingers drum against her thigh, I would quickly distract Tommy, leading him to another room or engaging him in a game that would keep his attention away from whatever was about to happen. "Let's go play in the garden, Tommy," I would say, scooping him up before Mother could object. "Let's see if the flowers are blooming." I would carry him outside, pointing out butterflies and birds, keeping up a steady stream of cheerful chatter while my heart hammered in my chest. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mother's silhouette, waiting for me to return, her patience growing thinner with each passing minute. When Tommy was 2, he started talking, and I lived in constant terror that he would accidentally reveal something that would shatter Mother's carefully constructed image. Not because he understood what he was seeing, but because children have a way of stating uncomfortable truths with innocent clarity. "Ellie's sad," he said one afternoon, reaching up to touch my face where tears had been falling. We were in the living room, and Mother was in the kitchen, close enough to hear every word. "No, sweetheart, Ellie's not sad," I whispered, forcing a smile. "Ellie's happy. See? Happy." But Tommy was persistent, the way 2-year-olds are. "Ellie crying. Mama made Ellie cry." My blood turned to ice. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Mother's back stiffen, her hands pausing in their dishwashing. I had maybe seconds before she came to investigate. "Tommy, let's play a game," I said quickly, my voice too bright, too desperate. "Let's see how quiet we can be. Like little mice. Can you be a quiet little mouse?" He giggled and nodded, putting his tiny finger to his lips. "Shoo, Ellie. Quiet mouse." I held him close, my heart breaking as I realized what I was teaching him. I was showing him that silence was safety, that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. I was passing on the same lessons Mother had taught me, wrapping them in games and giggles to make them easier to swallow. The worst part was watching Tommy's confusion when Mother would suddenly become cold toward me. He would look back and forth between us, his little face scrunched up in bewilderment, trying to understand why Mama was angry and why Ellie was scared. "Mama mad at Ellie?" he would ask, his voice small and uncertain. No, sweetheart, I would lie, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Mama loves Ellie very much. She's just tired. But Tommy's eyes were too smart, too observant. He was learning, even at 2 years old, that our house held secrets that couldn't be spoken, emotions that couldn't be acknowledged, truths that were too dangerous to name. I was supposed to protect him from Mother's darkness, but instead, I was teaching him to live in it. I was showing him that love meant silence, that safety meant lies, that the people who hurt you were the same ones who claimed to love you most. And the most heartbreaking part was that he trusted me completely. He believed every lie I told him, every smile I forced, every time I pretended that everything was normal in our perfectly perfect house. At 17, I thought I had found my salvation in David Morrison's shy smile and gentle hands. He was everything Mother wasn't, quiet where she was controlling, patient where she was demanding, soft-spoken where she was sharp-tongued. When he asked me to marry him 2 weeks after graduation, I said yes before he could finish the question. Marriage? Mother's voice was silk wrapped around steel when I told her. Oh, darling, you're far too young to understand what marriage requires. But for once, I held my ground. David represented freedom, escape, a chance to become someone other than Mother's perfectly crafted doll. His family was kind, his mother actually smiled when she looked at me, his father asked about my interests without correcting my posture. They seemed to exist in a world where love didn't require constant vigilance. I love him, Mother, I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I had never been allowed to love anything before. Mother's eyes narrowed, but she smiled that public smile, the one she wore like armor. Of course you do, sweetheart. But love isn't enough for a successful marriage. You need guidance. You need someone who understands what it takes to mold a proper wife. The wedding planning became another battlefield. Mother inserted herself into every decision, from the color of my bouquet to the wording of our vows. She chose my dress, a high-necked, long-sleeve creation that made me look like a child playing dress-up. She selected the menu, the flowers, even the song for our first dance. This is what mothers do, Eleanor, she explained as she vetoed my suggestion for a simple ceremony. We ensure our daughters have the weddings they deserve, even when they're too young to know what they want. David tried to intervene, gently suggesting that maybe I should have more say in my own wedding. Mother's response was swift and brutal. David, dear, I'm sure you mean well, but Eleanor has very particular tastes. She's been raised with certain standards. I wouldn't want her to be embarrassed by anything common. The way she said common made it clear that David's family, with their modest home and unpretentious ways, fell firmly into that category. I watched him shrink under her gaze, his confidence wilting like a flower in drought. Our wedding day felt like a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. Mother straightened my dress, adjusted my veil, and whispered last-minute instructions in my ear as we walked down the aisle. Remember, shoulders back, chin up. Don't forget to smile, but not too broadly. And for heaven's sake, don't cry during the ceremony. It's unbecoming. I walked toward David in a daze, my feet moving automatically while my mind remained trapped in Mother's web of expectations. Even on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I was still performing for her approval. The first months of marriage were a revelation. David was kind, patient, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. But I didn't know how to be a wife to someone who wasn't constantly evaluating my worth. I found myself waiting for corrections that never came, bracing for punishments that never materialized. You can relax, Eleanor, David would say when he caught me sitting ramrod straight on our couch. This is your home now. You don't have to be perfect all the time. But I didn't know how to be anything else. Perfection was the only language I spoke fluently. The problem started slowly. David's gentleness, which had initially felt like freedom, began to feel like indifference. When he didn't notice that I'd overcooked the roast, I felt lost. When he didn't correct my posture or comment on my appearance, I felt invisible. I had been trained to measure love by the intensity of attention I received, even when that attention was cruel. "You seem unhappy," David observed one evening, watching me fold laundry with military precision. "Are you missing your mother?" I was missing something, but it wasn't mother exactly. I was missing the structure, the rules, the constant awareness of being observed and evaluated. Without them, I felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting aimlessly in calm waters. Mother visited every Sunday, ostensibly to check on my well-being but really to inspect my performance as a wife. She would run her finger along our windowsills, checking for dust. She would examine our refrigerator, making subtle comments about my meal planning. She would observe David and me together, her eyes cataloging every interaction for future criticism. "Marriage is an adjustment, Eleanor," she would say as she folded my kitchen towels into perfect rectangles. "You're fortunate to have someone who cares enough to guide you through it." Gradually, David began to change. Not into a monster like mother, but into someone who seemed tired of having to navigate around my constant anxiety. He stopped asking about my day when he came home from work. He stopped suggesting activities or outings. He retreated into his newspaper and his evening television programs, leaving me to manage our household with the obsessive attention to detail mother had drilled into me. "You don't need to iron my work shirts, Eleanor," he would say, but his voice carried the weariness of someone who had given up trying to understand his wife's compulsions. I ironed them anyway. I cleaned our small house until it gleamed. I cooked elaborate meals that we ate in silence. I had escaped mother's physical presence, but I had brought her psychological prison with me. I was still performing for an audience of one, still desperately trying to earn love through perfect behavior. When Tommy turned 5, mother began bringing him to our Sunday visits. He would run to me with genuine joy, and I would hold him close, breathing in his innocence like oxygen. But I could see mother watching our interactions, evaluating my performance as a sister just as she had always evaluated my performance as a daughter. "Eleanor's doing so well as a wife," she would tell Tommy, her voice dripping with false pride. "She's learned to take such good care of her husband." I realized then that I hadn't escaped at all. I had simply moved my cage to a different room. When Sarah was born, I held her in my arms and made a promise that I would be everything mother wasn't. I would be gentle, patient, understanding. I would never raise my voice, never criticize, never make her feel like she had to earn my love through perfect behavior. I kept that promise for exactly 4 years. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Sarah was playing in the living room while I prepared breakfast, her blonde curls catching the sunlight as she arranged her dolls in a careful tea party. She was such a beautiful child, with David's kind eyes and what I hoped was a spirit that would never be broken the way mine had been. "Mama, can Dolly have some juice?" she asked, holding up her favorite doll with the missing arm. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, smiling as I poured a tiny amount of orange juice into one of her toy cups. "But be careful not to spill it." I should have seen it coming. Sarah was 4, spills were inevitable, natural, part of childhood. But I had been trained to see disasters in normal moments, to anticipate failures before they happened. She carried the tiny cup with both hands, her tongue poking out in concentration. I watched her, my body tensing involuntarily as she navigated around the coffee table. When she stumbled over her own feet, sending the cup flying and orange juice splashing across our white carpet, something inside me snapped. "Sarah!" The word exploded from my mouth with a force that made her flinch. "Look what you've done." Her lower lip began to tremble, and I saw fear flash across her face, the same fear I had worn for the first 18 years of my life. But instead of that recognition stopping me, it seemed to fuel something dark and familiar. "I told you to be careful," I continued, my voice rising with each word. "Now look at this mess. Do you see what happens when you don't listen?" Sarah began to cry, quiet hiccuping sobs that should have melted my heart. Instead, I felt Mother's voice rising in my throat, Mother's words spilling from my lips. Stop crying this instant. Big girls don't cry over their own mistakes. I moved toward her, my hand raised, and in that moment, I saw my reflection in the window, my face twisted with anger, my body poised to strike. I looked exactly like Mother had looked 1,000 times before, standing over me with that same expression of righteous fury. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was about to become her. After everything I had endured, everything I had sworn to protect Sarah from, I was about to repeat the same pattern that had destroyed my childhood. I dropped my hand and stumbled backward, my whole body shaking. Sarah was still crying, but now she was backing away from me, her small hands pressed against the wall as if she were trying to disappear into it. I'm sorry, I whispered, but the words felt hollow. Mama's sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to shout. But the damage was done. I had seen the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had lived in my own eyes for so many years. I had seen her trying to make herself smaller, the way I had learned to do. In one moment of lost control, I had shown her that love could turn dangerous without warning. That night, after Sarah was asleep and David was watching television, I stood in her doorway and watched her small form under the covers. She had been quieter than usual during dinner, more careful with her movements, more attentive to my mood. She was already learning to read the signs, to anticipate my reactions. Just like I had learned to read Mother's. The next morning, I woke up determined to be better. I made Sarah's favorite breakfast, spoke only in gentle tones, and promised myself that the previous day had been an aberration. But the pattern had been established. Over the following weeks, I found myself losing control more frequently, my voice rising at spills, at noise, at the simple chaos of childhood. Sarah, sit up straight at the table, I would snap, my hand automatically reaching to adjust her posture. Young ladies don't slouch. Don't play with your food. It's wasteful and unbecoming. Walk, don't run. You'll hurt yourself or break something. Each correction felt necessary in the moment, justified by my desire to raise a well-behaved child. But I could see Sarah changing, becoming more careful, more controlled, more desperate to please me. She was learning the same lessons I had learned, absorbing the same poison that had infected my own childhood. The breaking point came when Mother visited for Sarah's 5th birthday. She watched our interactions with approval, nodding as I corrected Sarah's posture, smiling when I made her redo her thank you speech because she had mumbled the first time. You're doing such a wonderful job with her, Eleanor, Mother said, her voice warm with pride. She's becoming such a little lady. Just like you were at her age. The comparison made my blood run cold. I looked at Sarah, sitting perfectly still in her party dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face carefully composed in a polite smile. She looked exactly like I had looked in all those childhood photographs, beautiful, perfect, and utterly terrified. That night, I found Sarah in her room, practicing her walk in front of the mirror, her small shoulders pulled back, her chin raised to an unnatural angle. She was mimicking the posture I had been unconsciously teaching her, trying to perfect it so she wouldn't disappoint me again. What are you doing, sweetheart? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Practicing, Mama, she said without turning around. I want to be a good girl. I sat down heavily on her bed, watching my daughter transform herself into the same kind of anxious perfectionist I had been. She was 5 years old, and I was already stealing her childhood, just as Mother had stolen mine. Come here, Sarah, I said, my voice breaking. She approached cautiously, probably expecting another correction. Instead, I pulled her into my arms and held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the lingering sweetness of birthday cake. I'm sorry, I whispered against her hair. I'm so sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. I needed to do something drastic, something that would break the cycle before it destroyed another generation. I needed to save Sarah from becoming me, and I needed to save myself from becoming Mother. I needed to run. I didn't leave that night. Not out of fear, not even out of doubt, but because I needed a plan. Real escape, I had learned, isn't a moment. It's a series of small, silent decisions made in the spaces no one notices. I spent the next 3 months moving carefully, methodically, the way I used to count my steps on the staircase or measure the angle of my chin at the dinner table. This time, though, it wasn't to please anyone. It was to save us. Sarah went to preschool during the mornings. I used that time to search through the classifieds, circling apartment listings I thought I could afford and making secret calls from the library's payphone. I created a checklist of what we'd need to survive: documents, clothes, cash. I knew I couldn't rely on David for help. By then, he had drifted into a kind of detached routine, coming home later and later, barely noticing how I hovered between despair and resolve. There had been no more outbursts like the one during Sarah's birthday. But that wasn't comfort, it was warning. I was walking a tightrope, holding in all the urges that had been carved into me like grooves in stone. Every time I heard Sarah cry or raise her voice in joy, I felt that tightening in my chest, that whisper that sounded too much like my mother's voice: fix her. Control her. Correct her before someone sees. I was fighting against the very instincts I'd been trained to follow, and I was terrified of how thin that line had become. The day I decided to leave, it was raining. Not heavily, just that kind of steady, whispering drizzle that softened the edges of everything. Sarah was napping after preschool, curled beneath a quilt my mother had made, the same one I had almost thrown away so many times. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her face, so peaceful, so soft, so unlike the child I had once been. For a long time, I just watched her breathe. Then I stood, walked to the kitchen, and called the apartment complex manager from a number I'd memorized. "Yes," I said when she asked if I was still interested. "We'll move in on Friday." That Friday, while David was at work, I packed only what we could carry. A single suitcase each. Birth certificates. Social security cards. Cash I had stashed in an old tampon box at the back of the linen closet. I left the rest: wedding photos, furniture, even my cookbooks. I didn't want any of it. I didn't want the life that had grown around my pain like ivy climbing a crumbling wall. I left a note on the kitchen table, not for David, but for myself. A promise in ink: you did not fail. You chose to break the pattern. Then I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. The apartment was small, one bedroom, thin walls, faded carpet that smelled faintly of onions. But it was ours. The first night there, I pulled the twin mattress onto the floor so Sarah and I could sleep side by side. She asked if it was a slumber party. I said yes. She giggled, and I cried silently into my pillow while she drifted off. Those first weeks were raw. Everything in me had been conditioned to seek structure, and now I had none. I questioned everything: my parenting, my decisions, even my right to safety. I woke up each night with a jolt, expecting to see Margaret's face at the door or hear David's key in the lock. But no one came. And eventually, my body started to believe the silence meant safety, not danger. Sarah thrived. Away from the eyes that had judged both of us for years, she became brighter, freer. She sang to her stuffed animals. She danced down the hallway with wild hair and bare feet. And every time I started to tell her to hush, to slow down, to fix her dress, I swallowed the words and watched instead. I was learning to parent without performance, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I took a part-time job shelving books at a local library, a quiet, clean place where people didn't expect me to smile if I didn't want to. The head librarian, Mrs. Kaufman, was a tall woman with silver hair and laugh lines so deep they seemed carved by decades of kindness. She didn't ask about my past. She didn't question my qualifications. She just handed me a key and said, "Everyone starts somewhere." At night, after Sarah went to bed, I wrote in a spiral notebook I kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. Not stories, not poetry, just memories. I wrote them down like inventory, as if naming them might finally remove their power. I wrote about the silence punishments. The forced walks. The hands at my throat. I wrote about Sarah's face that day with the orange juice, and how close I had come to becoming my mother. I didn't know it then, but I was beginning the slow process of reclaiming my own mind. One afternoon, about 2 months after we moved in, I received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, not Martinez. My legal name. The one still tied to a man I hadn't spoken to since we left. I opened it with shaking hands and found a short note from David. No accusations. No threats. Just 6 words scrawled in his familiar handwriting. I hope you're both doing okay. I stared at the page for a long time. There were no tears, no anger, just a dull ache of finality. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the back of my notebook, behind all the pages filled with the things I never said. Sarah was safe. I was safe. We had a long way to go, but we had started. That night, as I watched her fall asleep beside me on our little mattress, I whispered the same promise I had made the day she was born, this time with more understanding than fear. I won't be perfect, sweetheart. But I will be free. And I will teach you how to be free, too. And that, I think, is where healing begins, not in forgetting the past, but in choosing not to carry its weight into the future. I didn't start therapy right away. For a long time, I convinced myself that leaving was enough, that by physically separating myself from Margaret and David, I had somehow cleansed my soul of their imprint. But trauma is not a coat you take off at the door. It seeps into your bones, into your breath, into the very way you interpret the world around you. I thought I was free, but my body still flinched at sudden noises. My voice still softened into apology even when I had nothing to apologize for. And worst of all, I still caught myself watching Sarah too closely, as if I were measuring her for mistakes. It wasn't until Sarah was 14, tall and shy and already smarter than I had ever been at that age, that I realized I could no longer pretend I was doing this on my own. We had survived the early years. I had built a life for us, a steady job at the library, a small 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of lavender and paperbacks, friends who knew my favorite tea but not my middle name. On the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, I was still reacting to ghosts. And Sarah was starting to notice. One evening, she came home from school and tossed her backpack onto the couch with a thud. I turned from the stove too quickly, and the way my body braced, as if expecting punishment, froze her mid-step. "Mom," she said, her voice cautious. "Why do you do that? That flinch thing." I laughed it off, too quickly. "Just startled me, that's all." But she didn't smile. "I think maybe you should talk to someone." The irony was not lost on me, my teenage daughter, gently suggesting the very thing I'd denied myself for decades. I stared at her for a long moment, unsure whether to be proud or ashamed. But in the end, I nodded. "I think you're right." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to agree. And maybe I hadn't expected it either. But that conversation became the hinge on which my next chapter turned. I found a therapist through the community clinic. Her name was Dr. Louise Arnett. She wore soft cardigans and tortoiseshell glasses and never once asked me to rush. During our first session, I sat stiffly on the edge of the couch and recited my story like a court deposition, factual, clean, emotionally distant. Margaret was abusive. David was indifferent. I had tried to do better. The end. Dr. Arnett didn't interrupt. She just nodded slowly, then said, "That's a lot to carry alone." I blinked at her, unsure how to respond. No one had ever said that to me. No one had ever acknowledged the weight without adding blame or disbelief. Week by week, We peeled back the layers. She taught me how to identify what I was feeling, something so basic for most people, but utterly foreign to me. I had spent my life reading other people's cues, molding myself into what they needed. But when she asked me how I felt, I often sat in silence, sifting through confusion. "Anger is allowed," she said once, when I confessed that I didn't know how to be mad without fear. "So is grief." Grief. That was the hardest emotion to name. Because what was I grieving, really? A mother I had never truly had. A childhood that had been more performance than play. A version of myself that never got to exist. Some weeks I would leave her office feeling strong, affirmed, capable of change. Other weeks I would cry in my car in the parking lot, unraveling in the privacy of a parked Ford Taurus with the windows rolled up. Healing wasn't linear. It wasn't clean. It wasn't something I could schedule or organize like the library stacks I managed every day. Some days I was proud of the mother I had become. Other days, I saw Margaret's shadow in the way I corrected Sarah's tone or reminded her to clean her room. But therapy gave me tools. It gave me words. And more than anything, it gave me the language to talk to my daughter about things I had once buried in silence. One night, when Sarah was 16, we stayed up late drinking chamomile tea in the living room. She was telling me about a friend whose parents had split up, her voice tentative. "I'm glad you left Dad," she said quietly. I didn't understand it back then. But now I do. I looked at her over the rim of my mug, the lamplight catching the gold flecks in her eyes. "I didn't leave him because he was bad. I left because I was broken. And I didn't want to keep breaking you." She nodded. "You didn't." But I wasn't sure that was true. I knew there were scars I had left behind, even if they were faint. Hypervigilance. Perfectionism. That quiet way Sarah sometimes folded herself inward when she was anxious, the way I used to do at her age. I couldn't erase the legacy of my own damage. But I could keep trying to repair it. When Sarah left for college, I cried, not because I was afraid for her, but because I had lived long enough to give her the freedom I'd never had. I helped her pack her bags, folded her favorite sweatshirt, and slipped a note into her suitcase: "You are already enough. You've always been enough." After she was gone, the apartment felt too quiet. I went back to therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I finally believed I deserved wholeness, not just survival. Dr. Arnett and I talked about boundaries. About trust. About how hard it is to receive kindness when you've spent your life anticipating cruelty. I dated a man for a few months, a retired science teacher named Bill who loved crossword puzzles and jazz. When I broke things off, it wasn't because he had done anything wrong, it was because I still hadn't figured out how to be touched without flinching. But even that, Dr. Arnett said, was progress. "You knew your limit," she told me. "And you honored it." That's what healing became for me, not erasing the past, but living with it gently. Not being perfect, but being real. Not always succeeding, but trying again. And perhaps most miraculously of all, I began to forgive myself, not Margaret, not David, not the world that failed to see, but myself. For the years I spent repeating what I had learned. For the fear that still gripped me in quiet moments. For the nights I still woke up screaming. Because healing, I finally understood, was not a destination. It was a practice. A choice I made every day. And for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. I was 57 when the phone call came. A name I hadn't heard aloud in over 2 decades echoed through the receiver: Margaret Thompson. The nurse on the line said she was in hospice care now, advanced stage liver cancer, not much time left. They found my number in her medical file, still listed as her next of kin. There was a pause, an unspoken question hanging between us: would I come? I didn't answer right away. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the cup of tea I'd forgotten to drink. The steam had vanished. The warmth had gone. The silence in the room thickened until I felt like I was breathing underwater. That night, I walked through my apartment as if the walls themselves remembered her. I ran my fingers along the windowsill, wiped invisible dust from the table, arranged the books on the shelf with careful precision. For one evening, I let myself fall into the old rituals, straightening, correcting, perfecting, as if she might walk through the door at any moment, purse on her arm and judgment in her eyes. Then I stopped. I stood in the center of my living room and looked around. This was my space. My home. The dust was mine, the clutter mine, the imperfections mine. And she wasn't coming through that door. Not ever again. But the question remained, should I go to her? I didn't owe her a goodbye. She had forfeited that right years ago, with every rule, every punishment, every bruised memory she tried to polish into obedience. She never apologized. Never even acknowledged what she'd done. But part of me, some stubborn, aching part, still wanted to see her one last time. Not for her. For me. For the frightened little girl who still woke up sweating, waiting for footsteps in the hallway. I flew back to Pennsylvania alone. Sarah offered to come, but I told her this was something I needed to do by myself. It had been 30 years since I'd left Millbrook. The town had changed, but not as much as I had hoped. The streets were still narrow and lined with sycamores. St. Mary's still stood like a monument to silence. The air carried that same damp heaviness I remembered from my childhood, like secrets soaking into the skin. The hospice was quiet, tucked behind an aging Lutheran church. A nurse led me down a beige hallway to a room with a single bed and a small window that let in the gray afternoon light. And there she was, Margaret Thompson, the woman who had ruled my world like a queen with a velvet whip. She looked smaller than I remembered. Shriveled. Shallow breaths pushed through her parted lips. Her eyes were closed, her skin translucent, a ghost in waiting. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step closer or run. Then, slowly, I walked to the chair beside her bed and sat. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands didn't tremble. I felt strange, steady, even, but hollowed out, like the core of something old and carved. She stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a second, I thought she didn't recognize me. But then her mouth pulled into the faintest smile. "Eleanor," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. "You came." I didn't answer. "I always knew you'd come back eventually," she murmured. "You were never strong enough to stay away forever." The words struck like a familiar slap, not for their cruelty, but for their predictability. Even now, on the edge of death, she clung to her power, to the myth of her own righteousness. "I didn't come for you," I said quietly. "I came for me." She blinked slowly. "Such dramatics." "I raised you better than that." "No," I said, and this time my voice didn't waver. "You trained me. You didn't raise me. You broke me down and molded me into something that wouldn't embarrass you. You raised a puppet, not a daughter." Her eyes sharpened, and for a flicker of a moment, I saw her, the woman who had stood behind me in photographs with smiling eyes and clenched hands. "I did what I had to," she whispered. "You were difficult. You cried too much. You were too sensitive." "I was a child," I replied. "I was supposed to cry. I was supposed to be messy and loud and imperfect. But you made me terrified of my own existence. You made me hate myself." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was weighted, dense, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after the last arrow has flown. "I don't remember it that way," she said at last. "I know," I said. "That's the tragedy. I didn't stay long. There was nothing left to salvage. I had come looking for something, maybe a final admission, maybe an apology, maybe just confirmation that she had once been human. But she offered none of those. She died as she lived, clinging to control, blind to the harm she caused, confident that her version of reality was the only one worth believing. Before I left, I stood by the window and looked at her one final time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt done. I survived you, I whispered. That will have to be enough. Then I turned and walked out, never once looking back. On the flight home, I didn't cry. Instead, I watched the clouds drift beneath the plane and thought of Sarah, of her laugh, her freedom, her softness. I thought of the line I had drawn between generations and the fact that, somehow, I had held it. Margaret Thompson was gone. But I was still here. Still healing. Still fighting. Still free. It wasn't until after Margaret died that I truly began to see the shape of the legacy she left behind, not in the funeral program, which I declined to attend, nor in the estate I was never mentioned in, but in the quiet, unsettling ways her shadow still trailed through my life. Grief, if you could even call it that, didn't come like a storm. It came like fog, seeping into the corners, obscuring things I thought I'd already healed. But what unsettled me more was how often her voice still echoed through my own, uninvited. I caught it one afternoon when I visited Sarah and her family for dinner. She was 30 now, married, a mother to 2 lively little boys who spilled juice on the carpet and bounced from one question to the next like their legs couldn't stay still. I watched her gently redirect them with patience and grace, her voice calm even as one of them knocked over a plate of peas. And yet, when she looked to me with a weary smile and asked, "Did I act like that as a child?" something inside me tensed. I opened my mouth to answer and heard Margaret's cadence form behind my teeth, sarcastic, cold, correcting. Worse, I almost said. But I caught myself. Instead, I smiled. You were curious. Smart. Always in motion. Sarah didn't notice the shift, but I did. That moment haunted me for days afterward. I had spent decades undoing the damage Margaret had done to me. But I hadn't truly considered how much of that damage I had unintentionally passed down. Not in beatings, not in punishments, but in tone. In tension. In the subtle ways Sarah used to scan my face as a child, trying to read my mood before asking for something simple. That wasn't instinct, it was training. And I had done it. I had never hit her. I had never locked her in her room or made her stand in the corner with books on her outstretched arms. But I had snapped at her for spills. I had corrected her posture when no one asked. I had trained her to be cautious around my emotions, the way I had once been around Margaret's. And even though I had stopped, even though I had spent years actively choosing softness, the ripple effects remained. We spoke about it for the first time on a walk through her neighborhood park. The boys were running ahead, chasing ducks near the pond, and we moved slowly along the path lined with sycamores just starting to turn gold. Did I ever scare you? I asked her, my voice nearly lost to the wind. Sarah glanced at me, her brow furrowing. When I was little. I nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then said, sometimes, yes. I felt the air leave my lungs. But I didn't interrupt her. It wasn't like you hurt me. You didn't, she added quickly. But you disappeared. You'd get this look, and I knew I'd done something wrong, even if I didn't know what it was. You never yelled like Grandma did, but you went somewhere behind your eyes. And that was just as scary, because I didn't know how to reach you. I had to stop walking. My legs trembled under the weight of her honesty. But I let her keep going. I always knew you loved me, she said. But there were times I felt like I had to earn your approval, like it could disappear if I wasn't careful. It took me a long time to realize that wasn't about me. That it came from something older. Deeper. I sat on the nearest bench and stared at the path ahead, littered with fallen leaves. I thought of all the hours I'd spent in therapy, all the promises I'd made to break the cycle. And yet, here was the evidence, gentle, unintentional, but real, that trauma doesn't end just because we want it to. It echoes. It embeds. It spills. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Sarah sat beside me and took my hand. "You don't have to apologize, Mama. I've always known you were trying. That counts for more than you think." We sat there for a while, not saying much, just watching her boys splash through puddles, laughing with the unburdened joy of children who had never learned to be afraid of the sound of their own laughter. I spoke with Tommy not long after that. He'd grown into a kind man, quiet, steady, with a teacher's gentleness. We hadn't talked about Mother much over the years. He had been too young to remember most of it, and I had protected him from the worst. But after her death, something shifted. He called one evening and asked, "Was it really as bad as I think it was?" I told him the truth. Not every detail, not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to understand the weight I carried. Enough for him to see that the version of Mother he remembered, the smiling woman with the sugar cookies and the polished shoes, was a performance built on my obedience. "I used to feel guilty for not seeing it," he admitted. "For not doing something." "You were a child," I said gently. "You were never supposed to save me. That wasn't your job." We ended the call with something we had never said before, not because we hadn't felt it, but because the words had always gotten stuck behind too many silences. "I love you," I told him. "I love you too," he said. "And I'm proud of you." Those words wrapped around something inside me that had always been raw, always waiting for acknowledgement. Not from Margaret, but from someone who mattered. Someone who saw me not as a daughter or a survivor or a ghost, but as a whole person, still standing. The truth is, healing doesn't mean the damage disappears. It means learning to live with it in ways that don't cause more harm. It means having hard conversations with the people you love. It means facing the consequences of your own survival. And in those ripples, in those moments where honesty finally takes root, there's a different kind of grace. A grace I'm still learning to accept. I never set out to become anyone's guide. For most of my life, I just wanted to survive, quietly, invisibly, without drawing attention that might lead to correction. But there's something about age, about time and distance, that softens the jagged edges just enough to make room for something else, perspective. And with that perspective came the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, what I had lived through could mean something beyond me. It began with a flyer pinned to the bulletin board at the library. I had worked there for years by then, content to shelve books and organize story time and talk about novels with readers who wanted nothing from me but a recommendation. But that flyer, a simple black and white page with a tear-off tab, caught my eye one rainy afternoon. It read, "Volunteer advocates needed, support survivors of family abuse. Training provided." My hand moved before my mind had time to object. I tore off a tab and folded it into my sweater pocket, where it sat for 2 weeks before I had the courage to dial the number. The first meeting was held in a church basement that smelled of coffee and dust. There were 8 of us around the circle, some women younger than Sarah, others closer to my age, and a few men whose eyes flickered with the weight of unspeakable things. The facilitator, a woman named Rhonda, greeted everyone with the kind of grounded calm that only comes from walking through fire and making it out the other side. I didn't speak the first few sessions. I listened. I watched. I took notes I didn't need, mostly to keep my hands busy. But then one day, someone described the way their abuser had made them apologize for flinching. The words hit me like a blow to the chest, and before I could stop myself, I spoke. "That's not shame," I said quietly. "That's survival." The room fell still. Every face turned toward me, not with judgment, but with something even more unsettling, recognition. And that's when I understood, my story didn't have to stay buried. It could live out loud. It could breathe in the same air as other people's pain and, somehow, help it hurt a little less. I became a regular volunteer, then a peer mentor, then a speaker at small events and workshops for women learning to reclaim their lives. I never pretended to have answers. I only told the truth as I had lived it. I spoke about the rules, the silence, the invisible bruises. I told them how easy it is to become what you've survived. How hard it is to unlearn obedience. How healing is slow and sometimes silent and always worth fighting for. After one meeting, a woman maybe in her 40s approached me. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee, and she looked at me with a mixture of awe and desperation. "How did you stop it from defining you?" she asked. The things she did. I paused before answering, because the truth wasn't simple. "I didn't stop it from defining me," I said. "I just decided to define what it meant. And that was the difference. I would never be the person I might have been without Margaret. But I could choose to become someone because of what I survived, not in spite of it. My pain had shaped me, but it didn't own me. It didn't have to own anyone else either. Still, there were days it all felt too close. The smell of starch on a crisp dress shirt. A child being shushed too harshly in a grocery store. The way a stranger's voice could echo Margaret's tone just enough to make my stomach twist. I had learned how to cope, how to ground myself, how to remind my nervous system that I was safe. But trauma is not linear. It loops. It resurfaces. It waits for a crack in the wall, and then it whispers through. What kept me grounded wasn't just therapy or routine or the passing of time. It was the faces of the people I'd met, those whose pain mirrored mine, who had found the courage to say, "Me too," and meant it in the deepest sense. It was Sarah, who now called me just to chat, not to seek approval. It was my grandson, who once looked up at me during a visit and said, "Grandma, you're funny," with the kind of open joy I never knew as a child. That single moment, his tiny voice, unburdened by fear, was worth every ounce of struggle. I had broken the cycle. I hadn't erased it, but I had stopped its forward march. And in that stillness, in that pause between generations, I found peace. One spring afternoon, I was invited to speak at a local high school, part of a health class unit on recognizing emotional abuse. I was hesitant at first. Teenagers could be brutal. But something in me knew that if even one of them recognized their own home in my story, it might change the course of their life. I stood in front of 30 students and told them about a woman who was praised for her cookies and her clean house and her perfect daughter, and how none of that could be seen through the front windows after dark. I told them how love isn't supposed to be earned, and how being afraid of someone you live with is never normal, no matter how kind they seem to everyone else. When I finished, a girl in the back row stayed behind. She didn't say much, just hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you." Her hand was cold. Her voice was small. I saw myself in her eyes. Afterward, I sat in my car and cried, not the bitter, gut-wrenching sobs of trauma, but the cleansing kind. The kind that makes room. The kind that tells you it mattered that you survived. That night, I called Sarah. We talked about her work, her boys, a new recipe she was trying. And just before she hung up, she said, "I'm proud of you, Mama." I smiled, really smiled. "Thank you," I said. "I'm starting to feel proud of me, too." The pain hadn't disappeared. But it had changed shape. It had become something useful. Something honest. Something that could reach across a circle of folding chairs in a church basement or a row of high school desks and say, "You're not alone. I've been there. And there's life after this." And that, I think, is how pain becomes purpose, not all at once, not perfectly, but in small, quiet ways that ripple outward like light through cracked glass. Now, at 73, I live a life that is quiet, gentle, and mine. The nightmares still come, though not as often. I still wake up sometimes with my heart racing, with Margaret's voice threading through the darkness like a wire pulled tight around my throat. But the difference now is that I know what to do. I sit up, I place my feet firmly on the ground, and I speak to the room aloud, just one sentence that has become my anchor: she is gone, and I am still here. Survival isn't as triumphant as people like to imagine. It isn't fireworks or parades. It's sitting through the silence that follows a trigger. It's resisting the urge to fold into old patterns. It's choosing, again and again, to walk into the world without the armor you were once forced to wear. I still catch myself bracing when someone raises their voice, still scan public rooms for exits out of habit. I've accepted that some scars are never meant to disappear. They're meant to remind us, not of what broke us, but of how we healed. Sometimes I look at myself in the mirror and try to find the little girl I used to be. The one with too straight posture and too careful eyes, who tiptoed through her own home like a trespasser. I see glimpses of her in the curve of my mouth, in the way my hands still fold when I'm anxious, in the instinct to apologize for speaking too long. But I don't hate her anymore. I don't blame her for what she couldn't stop or what she didn't understand. I gather her up gently, in memory and in breath, and tell her what no one ever told me: you never deserved what happened to you. I think that's the hardest part for people to understand about abuse that wears pearls and lipstick. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It smiles for the camera. It organizes bake sales and volunteers for the PTA and tells you to stop crying before anyone sees. And when you grow up in that world, when your pain is hidden behind perfection, you start to question your own memories. You ask yourself if maybe it wasn't so bad. If maybe you were the problem all along. But I know better now. And if someone had told me, back when I was 8 years old and balancing books on my head to please a mother who never wanted to be pleased, that one day I'd be standing in front of classrooms and support groups and strangers in coffee shops, telling my story without shame, I wouldn't have believed them. Back then, I thought my future would be a continuation of my past. But that's the lie trauma tells you, that you'll never be anything but what it made you. It's not true. I've met so many survivors over the years. Some who escaped early. Some who never got the chance. Some who didn't even realize what they had survived until they heard someone else put their pain into words. We are not rare. We are just quiet. And once we find our voices, the world begins to shift, slowly, but undeniably. Sarah now tells her children, "You can always come to me, no matter what." I hear her say it and feel something inside me exhale. I see her hug them when they cry, without judgment or urgency. She doesn't tell them to smile through their feelings. She teaches them to name them. To sit with them. To let them pass. And in doing so, she's breaking the pattern even more than I did. She's planting something new. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in the backyard watching my youngest grandson chase a butterfly through the overgrown grass. Sarah brought out lemonade and sat beside me, her legs tucked under her the way she used to as a child. We talked about nothing and everything: recipes, books, school schedules. And then, without warning, she said, "You know, I never realized how much strength it took to leave. Until I had kids of my own." I looked at her, at the lines forming at the corners of her eyes, at the softness in her voice. I felt tears prick the edges of mine, but I didn't look away. "I didn't feel strong," I said. "I felt terrified." "But you did it anyway," she said. "That's what matters." I think about that often, how we wait for strength to feel like courage when, in truth, it often feels like desperation wrapped in hope. I didn't leave Margaret because I was brave. I left because I couldn't stand the thought of Sarah learning to hate herself the way I had been taught to hate me. That's what finally broke the spell: love. Not the kind that controls or corrects or keeps tally. The kind that sets you free, even if it costs everything. The kind that says, "I will not let this continue." Not with me. I still have that photograph, the one of my 8th birthday party, where Margaret's hands rest on my shoulders like a noose made of pearls. I don't hide it anymore. It sits in a drawer beside my journal, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Of where I came from. Of who I survived. Of how far I've come. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and speak to her, not Margaret, but the girl in the photo. I tell her about the library, about the support groups, about the grandson who calls me Grandma Giggles. I tell her she made it out. That the world didn't end in that pink bedroom. That one day, she would stop apologizing for existing. That one day, she would sit beside a window with a cup of tea and finally feel safe in her own skin. To the other survivors, those still trapped, those halfway out, those trying to stitch their lives together from scattered pieces, I say this: you are not alone. Your pain is not imaginary. Your truth is not too much. You are not broken. You are becoming. We do not owe our silence to anyone who hurt us. We do not owe our forgiveness to those who never asked. What we owe, to ourselves, to the next generation, to the frightened children we once were, is honesty. And mercy. And rest. Because in the end, survival is not just about escaping the fire. It's about learning how to breathe in the smoke and still choose love. Even now, after all this time, I still wake up some nights with her voice in my ears. But I no longer wake up screaming. I wake up speaking the truth. And that is enough.